16. Meditation and the Unseen Order. There were many wonderful things about that first meditation retreat I attended back in the summer of 2003. And there was one not-so-wonderful thing. A song got stuck in my head. When you're on a silent meditation retreat, songs can stay in your head for a really long time, because there's not much input to displace them. And this song was one I don't especially like. It's by Foreigner, a group that had a burst of prominence when I was in college, and it's called Feels Like the First Time. The chorus begins, "And it feels like the first time, like it never did before. Feels like the first time, like we've opened up the door." I don't want to make this sound easy. Though incremental enlightenment and incremental liberation can gather momentum via mutual assistance, it's not as if they're automatically self-sustaining. There are obstacles, and they can be frustrating, and meditation can be a pain. The good news is that the pain can lead to gain if you hang in there, if you don't shrink from anxiety or sadness, but instead observe them mindfully, if you don't give up on a morning's sitting in the face of restless boredom, but instead observe it mindfully, which, oddly, can be harder than observing anxiety or sadness mindfully. I'll never forget something that Narayan said on my first meditation retreat. Boredom can be interesting. It's true, but seeing its truth will involve first spending some time absorbing another truth. Boredom can be really boring, and persisting in the face of it. Maybe the biggest impediment to continued meditative progress is the unfortunate finiteness of time. If you have much in the way of responsibilities, a job, kids to rear, school to attend, whatever, you can't devote huge chunks of each day to meditation. And in my own experience, the difference between 30 minutes a day and 50 minutes a day is big. And in the experience of people I've talked to, the difference between 30 minutes a day and 90 is huge. But even if you're down near the 20-minute end of the spectrum, your practice can have depth. And that's especially true if you keep in mind the basic take-home lesson of Buddhist meditative philosophy. Those little moments of truth you're getting each day, at least that you're getting on a good day, are pieces of a bigger truth, a truth about the nature of reality and about the distortions, even delusions, imposed by our default perception of it. Sure, it would be great if you attained enlightenment and spent all your life feeling that big truth. But even if you can't, even if you have to work to bring that truth intermittently to mind, it can be a guiding truth. Saving the world through clarity. Okay, so that's much of the argument I'd make if people who don't meditate ask me why they should meditate. I talk about lots of little moments of truth, and how cultivating these moments can turn someone into a happier, better person. But this doesn't really get at the heart of the reason I hope more people will meditate. What motivated me to write this book isn't just the prospect of sprinkling little moments of truth into the lives of receptive readers, or even to convey the larger, guiding truth these moments point to. What motivated me to write this book is the idea of a moment of truth, in the singular. Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary defines a moment of truth as a moment of crisis on whose outcome much or everything depends. I don't think that's too strong a phrase for the planetary challenge I described in the previous chapter, the problem of ethnic, religious, national, and ideological conflict that can feed on itself, creating a spiral of growing hatred that leads to true catastrophe. Suggesting that meditation can help save the world is a good way to get written off as hopelessly naive. So let me stress that the idea here isn't to generate a worldwide wave of love and kindness. I mean, that would be great, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, and I don't think the salvation of the world requires it. I think the salvation of the world can be secured via the cultivation of calm, clear minds and the wisdom they allow. Such minds can, for one thing, keep us from overreacting to threats, and thus from feeding the vicious circles that intensify conflicts. Calm, clear minds can also help us soberly assess what animates the threats, and so figure out, for example, what kinds of things encourage people to join or support violent causes, and what kinds of things discourage them from doing that. We don't have to love our enemies, but seeing them clearly is essential. And one lesson from both Buddhist philosophy and modern psychology is that seeing them clearly involves dialing down the fear and loathing, but also more than that. It involves transcending much subtler distortions of perception and cognition, often distortions that are grounded in subtler feelings. This clarity of vision doesn't have to suddenly envelop the world. Even isolated pockets of equanimity and wisdom can make a difference and can prepare the ground for their own expansion. As with individual progress toward enlightenment, global progress toward enlightenment can be incremental and yet, through commitment, can acquire a momentum of its own. That said, I think there are going to have to be a whole lot of increments. In fact, I think there will have to be, in the long run, a revolution in human consciousness. I'm not sure what to call the revolution, maybe the metacognitive revolution, since it will involve stepping back and becoming more aware of how our minds work. But I think it's going to have to be something so dramatic that future historians will have an actual label for the transformation. Assuming there are future historians, and if there aren't, that will probably mean there was no successful transformation to label anyway. Near the outset of this book, I anointed myself a laboratory rat. I said that if I could get much in the way of benefits out of meditation, just about anybody could, because I am peculiarly ill-suited to calming down and focusing. Well, the results are in. Just about anybody can benefit from meditation. But those aren't all the results. The question I originally asked wasn't just whether I could get enough benefits from meditation to keep returning to the cushion every day, or even whether I could, to some extent, clarify my day-to-day moral vision. I also asked whether I could meet the particular moral challenge that centrally motivated the writing of this book, overcoming, or at least eroding, the psychology of tribalism. As I noted, along this dimension I am an especially valuable laboratory rat because, with all due humility, I so powerfully exemplify the problem. In a way, it's odd that I would be so tribalistic. I don't have a strong version of the most famously dangerous tribal allegiances: ethnic, religious, national. Maybe that's why I focus so much emotional energy on tribal boundaries defined by opinion, why I strongly identify with people who agree with me, and am capable of thinking somewhat unflattering things about people who disagree with me, which goes double or triple when the disagreement is about ideology, about policies that should or shouldn't be adopted. Here's an embarrassing irony. Nothing so arouses tribalistic animosities in me as people who support policies that, in my view, tend to arouse tribalistic animosities. To take just one example, I think most American military interventions of the past couple of decades have been mistakes, examples of overreacting to threats and thereby exacerbating them. And the people who have most strongly supported these interventions drive me nuts. And I want them to keep driving me kind of nuts. I wouldn't want to travel so far down the path toward nirvana that I was drained of fighting spirit. If full-on enlightenment means you quit making value judgments of any kind and quit pushing for change, then count me out. But believe me when I tell you that getting to that point in the path is not, for me at least, a looming peril. The question is whether I can get far enough down the path to conduct my ideological combat with these people wisely and truthfully, which in turn means viewing them more objectively and, in a sense, more generously than I'm naturally inclined to do. The answer is that I think meditation has, at a minimum, helped me move closer to this goal. But it's a struggle. When I exhort people to advance the metacognitive revolution by overcoming the cognitive biases that sustain tribalism, I can't hold myself up as one of the world's more compelling role models. The other thing I don't claim is that I have a step-by-step plan for the revolution. My main point is more abstract. It would be tragic, to say the least, if after billions of years of arduous effort on the part of organic life, effort that has gotten us to the verge of a global community of minds, we let the natural distortions in these minds blow the whole thing apart. It would be all the more tragic in light of the fact that these distortions are now a scientifically established fact, and that we have ways of correcting them, including, though not confined to, meditative practice. All I'm really saying is this: the means to the planet's salvation is at hand. Speaking of salvation. In my conjectures as to why I cried at that meditation retreat, I left out one possibly relevant thing. I was brought up religiously as a Southern Baptist. I started drifting away from the church as a teenager after comparing the theory of natural selection with the book of Genesis as accounts of how humans came to be. I've never felt a desperate yearning for something that would replace my Christian faith, but presumably the loss of it left a vacancy somewhere inside me, or that may account for my enduring interest in spiritual questions. On that summer night in Barrie, maybe I didn't just feel like I'd gotten to the mountaintop. Maybe I felt like I'd been climbing that mountain since I was a teenager and left my native spiritual tribe. In any event, I don't think it's overstating the case to say that on that night I had a feeling of salvation, a feeling that may have been as powerful as the feeling that impelled me, at age 9 or 10, to walk to the front of the church during the minister's invitation and accept Jesus as my Savior. My departure from Christianity wasn't a bitter one, as some such departures are. I never felt that faith had damaged me. I guess, come to think of it, growing up with an ever-watchful and pretty strict God could help account for my acute and sometimes painful attention to my shortcomings. Indeed, maybe some residual sense of sinfulness is what drove me to embark on this whole exploration of Buddhist meditation. And maybe it's the reason the sense of salvation on that summer night was palpable. That would stand to reason. Both Buddhism and Christianity say that at birth we inherit a kind of moral confusion, the dispelling of which is one object of the game. In any event, I've never felt that my Christian years were some kind of brutal authoritarian brainwashing. I still love the Baptist hymns, notably Just As I Am, a song often sung softly at the end of the service to accompany the invitation. The song's message is basically that, though you're far from perfect, you're worthy of salvation. My most vivid memory of Sunday school is a good one, of singing, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Maybe I've selectively remembered the more enlightened parts of Christian ethics, but the Jesus to Buddha transition does seem in some ways a natural one. The Insight Meditation Society, the place where my mind opened up before my very eyes on that summer night, happens to reinforce this continuity. Before being purchased by Goldstein, Salzburg, and Cornfield, the red brick building that houses the society had been a novitiate, a place where Catholic priests trained. As you walk from the cloakroom toward the meditation hall, there are on either side of you stained glass windows with images of Jesus, one of him at the Last Supper and one of him praying intently, presumably shortly before the crucifixion. Every time I walk into that meditation hall, and I've now done so hundreds of times, I look at those images of Jesus. They pretty reliably give me some uplift, which is apt, because Jesus said that our perception of the world is distorted, and that we should work on correcting our blind spots rather than complain about the blind spots of others. You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Amen to that. I don't call myself a Buddhist because traditional Buddhism has so many dimensions of belief, of ritual, that I haven't adopted. I don't believe in reincarnation or related notions of karma, and I don't bow before the statue of the Buddha upon entering the meditation hall, much less pray to him or to any Buddhist deities. Calling myself a Buddhist, it seems to me, would almost be disrespectful to the many Buddhists in Asia and elsewhere who inherited and sustain a rich and beautiful religious tradition. Still, it's fair to ask, especially given my personal history, whether my meditation practice, along with the philosophy that undergirds it, qualifies as a religion. Does it do the kinds of things Christianity did for my parents, even though I've jettisoned the supernatural parts of Buddhism, and indeed retained the naturalistic parts a bit selectively? Is secular Buddhism a religion? If you were hoping to make that case, one person to turn to would be William James, who, more than a century ago, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, tried to find a framework that would encompass all the forms of experience, Eastern and Western, that we call religious. James said that, in the broadest sense, religion can be thought of as the belief that there is an unseen order, and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. Even naturalistic, secular Buddhism does, I'd argue, posit a kind of unseen order. As enlightenment begins to dawn, reality, which had seemed all chopped up, turns out to possess an underlying continuity, a kind of infrastructure of interconnection. Some people call it emptiness, others call it unity, but all agree that it looks less sharply fragmented than it looked before they got the picture. And what James called our supreme good does lie in harmoniously adjusting ourselves to this normally unseen order, regardless of whether you think of this supreme good as being our deepest happiness or our virtue. Of course, part of this adjustment of ourselves means thinking of ourselves as being less substantial, or at least less distinctly substantial than we might have previously thought ourselves to be. Indeed, this diffuseness of the self, and this porousness of the bounds of self, are part of the unseen order, a newly perceived continuity between what's inside of us and what's outside of us. There's also a second kind of unseen order posited by Buddhist teaching. Remember, a basic premise of Buddhism is that seeing the metaphysical truth, seeing the way things really are, both on the inside and the outside, and hence seeing the continuity between those two zones, in some sense amounts to seeing the moral truth, the moral equivalence between our welfare and the welfare of others. There is, in other words, a kind of structural alignment between metaphysical truth and moral truth. That's a kind of order, an order that can remain unseen if we don't practice the disciplines that make it manifest. This unseen order is not something we should take for granted. You can imagine a universe in which there is no such alignment, a universe in which seeing the metaphysical truth has no effect on your conduct toward other beings, or even inclines you to treat other beings more unkindly. But according to Buddhism, even the Western, more secular version of Buddhism, sometimes held to be insufficiently religious, we live in a universe in which seeing the metaphysical truth helps you see the moral truth. There is a natural unity of enlightenment. Then there's the third leg of this alignment, our well-being. Happiness, the elimination or at least lessening of suffering, of unsatisfactoriness, of dukkha, tends to coincide with seeing the metaphysical truth and acting on the attendant moral truth. This, too, is a kind of alignment that, presumably, a universe doesn't have to have. It's kind of amazing, when you think about it, that the world would be set up this way, that the path you embark on to relieve yourself of suffering would, if pursued assiduously, lead you to become not just a happier person, but a person with a clearer view of both metaphysical and moral reality. Yet that is the Buddhist claim, and there is substantial evidence in favor of it. This three-part alignment, the alignment of metaphysical truth and moral truth and happiness, is embodied in the richly ambiguous word that lies at the heart of Buddhist practice, Dharma. This ancient word is most commonly defined as the Buddha's teaching. That's accurate insofar as it goes, but the word also refers to the core truths that are being conveyed by the Buddha's teaching. Dharma thus denotes the reality that lies beyond our delusions, and for that matter, the reality about how those delusions give rise to suffering. I argue that considerations from evolutionary biology support an affirmative answer to that question. See Chapter 15. 10. The intuition that objects and beings we perceive have essences is, as the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness holds, an illusion. Specifically, it is an illusion engineered by natural selection to identify the significance of things with respect to the Darwinian interests of the organisms doing the perceiving. See Chapters 10 and 11. The Darwinian defense of the idea of emptiness is quite different from traditional Buddhist defenses of the idea, but it's compatible with them. Seeing essences in things doesn't always lead us to suffer or to inflict suffering on others, but it can. In particular, an essentialist view of other people and groups of people can lead us to countenance or intentionally cause their suffering. See Chapter 12. So awareness that essence is a perceptual construct, not a reality, can be valuable, especially if paired with meditative practice that dampens the sense of essence or permits selective engagement with it. Advanced meditators who report having lost a sense of essence fairly broadly, that is, who report apprehending emptiness or formlessness in a fairly thoroughgoing way, seem to be very happy and, in my limited experience, benevolent people. See Chapter 13. 11. The preceding point about essence and essentialism is one illustration of the broader proposition that not seeing the world clearly can lead not just to our own suffering, but to bad conduct in the sense of making others suffer needlessly. Or to put a more positive spin on it, seeing the world more clearly can make you not just happier, but more moral. This isn't a guaranteed outcome. There have been very good meditators who were, apparently, very happy and, manifestly, very bad people. Still, there is a close enough association between the psychological dynamics that make us suffer and the psychological dynamics that make us behave badly toward people that the Buddhist prescription for lessening or ending suffering will tend to make us not just happier, but better people. That this moral progress isn't guaranteed is one reason meditative instruction has typically been paired with a sort of ethical instruction that is so prominent in Buddhism. See Chapter 16. 12. Many Buddhist teachings, including several of those listed here, could be lumped under the rubric of awareness of conditioning, where conditioning means, roughly speaking, causes. Mindfulness meditation involves increased attentiveness to the things that cause our behavior, attentiveness to how perceptions influence our internal states, and how certain internal states lead to other internal states and to behaviors. This attentiveness includes an awareness of the critical role feelings seem to play in these chains of influence, a role shaped by natural selection, which seems to have calibrated feelings as part of its programming of our brains. Importantly, the meditative practices that bring awareness of these chains of influence also empower us to intervene and change the patterns of influence. To a large extent, that's what Buddhist liberation is. A fairly literal escape from chains of influence that had previously bound us, and often to which we had previously been blind. See Chapter 14. So these are some of the main considerations that I hope justify the title, Why Buddhism is True. But if you want the shortest version of my answer to the question of why Buddhism is true, it's this: because we are animals created by natural selection. Natural selection built into our brains the tendencies that early Buddhist thinkers did a pretty amazing job of sizing up, given the meager scientific resources at their disposal. Now, in light of the modern understanding of natural selection and the modern understanding of the human brain that natural selection produced, we can provide a new kind of defense of this sizing up. A note on terminology. Writing a book on Buddhism confronts you with a number of choices about terminology. For starters, there is the Sanskrit versus Pali question. In Western writing, Buddhist terms are usually rendered in one of these two ancient languages, though there are also ancient Buddhist texts in other Asian languages. Some authors of books about Buddhism pick one language or the other and stick with it. That's not the path I chose, and I thought I'd explain why. The first big Buddhist concept this book engages with at length, not self, is emphasized more in Theravada Buddhism than in the other main branch, Mahayana Buddhism. The Theravada canon is in Pali, so it felt natural to render not self as anatta, as opposed to the Sanskrit anatman. But the second big Buddhist concept the book tackles, emptiness, gets more emphasis in the Mahayana tradition, and for that reason the term is usually rendered in Sanskrit, sunyata. And a few key terms that are prominent in both traditions have, as it happens, become well known in the West in their Sanskrit forms, in particular nirvana and dharma, as opposed to the Pali nibbana and dhamma. So here I went with Sanskrit. Having made the decision to use both Sanskrit and Pali, I then had to face borderline cases, where there wasn't a particularly strong argument for either. I won't bore you with my reasons for making every choice I made. In some cases, I more or less flipped a coin. On the sutra, Sanskrit versus sutta, Pali issue, I've played it both ways, depending mainly on whether the text in question is more closely associated with the Mahayana or Theravada tradition. But this issue comes into play more in the notes and bibliography than in the text of the book itself, because in the text I've tended to use the word discourse in preference to sutra or sutta. One reason is that I think in some circles the word sutra has come to connote something more like a poem or a reflection than an argument. And by and large, the Buddhist texts I'm focusing on make arguments. They may not make arguments in the modern sense of the word, all terms defined, each step in the argument clearly delineated, but they are advancing propositions about psychology or philosophy and giving reasons for them. And these propositions are at the heart of this book. Finally, I use the word enlightenment a lot in the book, and actually, awakening would be a more literally accurate translation of the ancient term that is commonly rendered as enlightenment. This is the term that is the basis both for the Buddha, awakened one, and for the name of the tree, the Bodhi tree, under which the Buddha is said to have had his great awakening. Awakening certainly has its appeal as a translation, given the Buddhist idea that we ordinarily live in such delusion as to be in a kind of dream world, and given that I begin the book by embracing that idea. At the same time, notwithstanding this metaphorical aptness, Buddhist awakening involves more than just waking up. There has to be actual enlightenment in the sense of apprehending, often arduously, some elusive truths about the world. As it happens, the term enlightenment has another relevant dimension. It signifies the era when the West made a decisive turn toward rational analysis. This struck me as apt, given this book's argument that the Buddhist worldview, or at least the naturalistic part of it, makes great sense by the lights of the philosophy and science that emanated from that era.